Hello, my dear listeners and viewers. This is me, Leila, and my Sincerely Leila podcast. Welcome to the first episode of 2024. Today I have a special guest, Mary Efendi. She's an author from Azerbaijan, Baku. If you guys don't know, but I think everyone knows because I always mention it, I'm also Azerbaijani, and I wasn't born in Azerbaijan, but my father was born there. So I love my native motherland. I always feel proud to represent it, and I always am happy to introduce other talented people from my ethnic motherland. So Mary's book, her debut novel, became my first book of 2024 as well. I finished it this year and I absolutely loved it. The book is called I Sat Alone by the Gate, and it was released in the summer 2023, so it's still new and you still have your chance to read it. And I really hope that after listening to this podcast, you will definitely want to pick up this book and find out more about the main character, Mariam. We talked a lot with Mary about her life in the US and how this novel, although is based on her life, there are parts that were fictionalized. So it's very interesting to get to know part of writing from a writer herself, a published author, because one thing is to write a book, another is to publish it. And Mary explains it all in this interview. I also interviewed her as a journalist for the magazine that I work for, the Caspian Post. So it will be more personal for the article, but this podcast, it's kind of like a chat between us, and I'm also sharing my experience as an immigrant, as a Muslim woman. So it's a lot of topics, and that's why I love podcasts, because you don't always know where it's gonna go because it's live. Like, you just share your experiences, your thoughts. So if you just want to find out more about Mary, definitely read the article about her that I will write by the time this podcast is up. I will leave the link in the bio, in the description. This is not Instagram. But otherwise, I think we talked so much in this podcast that it should be definitely enough for you to get to know her more. But I'm gonna add that Mary's life is very interesting as an immigrant because she moved to the US at the age of 18, if I'm not mistaken, and then she spent there 20 years, and she moved back to Baku a year ago, and she shares her experience in this podcast as well. So definitely listen if you want to find out more. And without further ado, let's just start, because I'm sure it's going to be a long one and you just want to get to it, don't you? So Mary Efendi, welcome. Hi, Mary. So happy to have you on my podcast. You're actually the first guest of this year. So, and you're the first Azerbaijani on my podcast. And my podcast is not that long to have more guests. So it's like everything is for the first time. But I'm so grateful that you accepted my invitation. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here as well. In fact, I've always wanted to be on a podcast. This is my first one. So in that sense, a little dream came true first in 2024. So I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor.
For me as well. And actually, my first question is, do you prefer to be called Mary or Mekhdi, which is your Azerbaijani name, official name?
I've always been called Mary, even when I lived here. So I think Mary is good.
Okay, just to make sure, because I hate when people cannot pronounce like ethnic names and they're just like, I'll just call you like Tom or whatever, you know, because it's easier. So I always, especially because I'm Azerbaijani, I can say Mehriban, it's no problem for me, but I want to make sure that you're okay with it as well.
No, I don't know which one's worse, when they try to name you something else or when they butcher your name because they just can't pronounce it. And with a name like Mehriban for 20 years in the US, trust me, I'm so glad I didn't have to pick a name. Mary was actually my nickname when I was here as well. But you know, I know they have the best intentions, but sometimes I don't think they can manage the sound. They just stop there. So Mary has saved me. I was going to publish it under my full name because I felt like, you know, that's my full name. And as an author, I'd like to be known with my Azeri name. And then it turns out that there is a very famous painter And the marketing team of my publishing company, they said, if you Google Mekhdi Effendi for first 10 pages on Google, it's going to be this painter. And I also paint, so it gets really confusing. And your readers, if they really like your book, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to Google you, and they're going to see this other woman that has a similar painting style. So we suggest you go with Mary. And so that's how that decision was made. I think it really grew on me, and I kind of accepted it as my pen name, even though my legal name is Mekhdi. But that was the reason why we went with Mary, because otherwise it would have been very difficult to differentiate between me and her.
Oh, interesting. So actually, for those who are watching this podcast, Mary is in her studio in Old Town, right? In İçeri Şehir in Baku.
I moved.
Okay.
Still not very far from İçeri Şehir, but yeah, this is the home for all my paintings now. They're here. This is the one I'm working on right now. It's not done yet. And that is the famous cat, the cat that's on the cover.
I love your painting style. Actually, I read from your about the author part in your book that you have a studio in İçeri Şehir. So I was like, oh, she paints as well, but I had no idea your paintings are so beautiful and so unique.
Thank you. It's a gift of the pandemic. We all started doing something during the pandemic. So I haven't been painting for a long time. I just started because we were all going a little crazy at home, stuck with the kids.
So do you also write in the studio, or is it only for painting?
Writing for me is, I want to be very honest. I don't want to give false ideas around how I write. Because along with being a writer, I'm a mom, and really, I don't have the luxury to pick a certain place where I write. I love to have a routine, but it's like the last thing you get to have with kids because everything is so chaotic. So I write wherever I can, and it's much more driven by time and time of the day than place. When I was writing the book, I picked a certain time, which was Saturdays. It was the day when I didn't work and my husband could help take care of the kids. And so I realized that the optimal time for me to be gone, to still, be present at home, was very early morning. I'm also a morning person. So the first goal was to find the right time, which for me was somewhere between 5 a.m. and 1 p.m. The second thing was to find a place that's open, which in the US is like only Starbucks and some other coffee shops that open super early. I don't know why. I was the only person there. But it's not about where I write. It's when can I get away from my kids so I can write. It ends up being early morning very often because I'm more productive. But I've had some sessions where, I write, it's 9 p.m., my eyes are closing, but I need to finish the chapter before I go to bed.
Are you working on anything right now, literary?
Yeah, I have several projects that all came to me after I moved back to Baku a year ago. One of them is related to historical fiction. My debut novel is really dedicated to the immigrant experience, so it has the theme is really about emotional struggle, feeling of belonging. It's not really a historical fiction, but historical fiction is something that I really enjoy reading. And when I came back here and started reconnecting with some of the family members that are older, I realized that there's a huge chunk of history for Azerbaijan that has not been told, because in that period, sharing stories came with consequences. So we're talking about stories of repression. We're talking about poets and intellectuals being exiled or killed or imprisoned. And I don't think those stories were shared because it was a time where the less you knew, the better, the safer you were. And the people that know these stories, they are like 80 years old, 90 years old. So I started interviewing that generation and gathering little stories. That's my way of writing. It's like collecting little pieces of cloth and then making a quilt out of it. I'm in the process of taking those stories and then creating a historical fiction book about the historical period between the 30s and 90s when Soviet Union fell apart, because there are lots of drama there. There's lots of material for a good novel. And I think that story needs to be told. I mean, we're a small country, but we've been through a lot. And, that's my job as a writer, to illuminate something so that it's not forgotten in time. The second one that I think I will definitely have to write about is the experience of moving back after 20 years in the US, and really telling the story of somebody who is not a local anymore, because I've lived most of my life in the US, but is treated as a local because I have roots here. And that emotional turmoil that comes with that would be a short way of, reverse culture shock, I would call it.
Yeah. Just to go back to Azerbaijan and the history, I think I myself am now discovering so much about that period that our parents went through, our grandparents went through. So I think this topic right now is so popular for so many people our age or younger, older, millennial generation. I think especially because you're still millennial, right?
I think so.
Yeah, it's just so confusing. I actually met up with a girl and she's like, I was born in 2000, but I think I'm a millennial. I'm like, no, honey, you're Gen Z. You're too young to be a millennial. She's like, no, I don't consider myself a Gen Z. So it's just so confusing. But I think it's more in terms of experiences. And I feel like this post-Soviet generation shares the same feeling of not knowing who we are, because our parents weren't allowed to learn history, and then here we are trying to learn something from ground zero that was never before, because Azerbaijan was a republic for 2 years. Kazakhstan never was. Kazakhstan was always under Russian Empire, because that's where I'm from, and my mom is Kazakh, so I'm mixed. So it's just both of my countries share this experience of suppressed history, suppressed culture. And so I am looking forward to reading this book or collection of stories, whatever it will be. I really think as an Azerbaijani, I celebrate each and every time when Azerbaijanis today get to tell our stories ourselves, because I'm so also sick and tired, I always say this, of white people telling our stories for us when we can do it ourselves. We don't need anyone to come in and explain our history to us. So I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that, I grew up hearing these stories, but I think it really comes, the interest to delve into these stories comes at a certain age. For the longest time, I could care less about these stories. They were just funny stories or exciting stories that my grandma would tell me. And I would listen to them, and then I would move on. And I really didn't have any desire to put the pieces together until a certain age. And then you start asking yourself that question. You start caring about identity. I think it happens a little earlier with the information and everything, with the younger generations. They start caring earlier. They start asking those questions earlier. But for us, it's you study, then you're trying to get on your feet, stand strong on your 2 feet, and then you start going back and my grandma used to tell me these stories about war, how they were in a village in Baku, and her dad was declared the enemy of state, and they didn't have anything to eat. And for the longest time, I don't think I understood that she's talking about hunger. It all sounded like a cool adventure to me, until I moved back here and heard those stories again. And I'm like, oh gosh, this needs to be told. It's crazy how many lives were completely butchered because of some political agenda, and how a whole nation was repressed with such incredible consequences for years to come, because of a certain, because it was not, it wasn't advantageous to the history of the political agenda of Soviet Union. So you become you go back and become interested in those stories, and they're really incredible. Any house you go to in Baku, you can find that one grandma that's going to tell you a crazy story of her father or grandfather who was repressed, and the wife followed him. It's blockbuster stuff. But we're so used to it because everybody went through this that we didn't really pay attention to these stories in the past because they were so repetitive. Everybody had this story of, my grandfather was repressed, the wife followed him, then we don't know what happened, and then one person survived and here we are. So it's crazy. It's crazy what our country went through. And I do agree. I think partially the reason why we now have a chance to tell these stories is because of immigration. Because now we have second generation immigrants that have a very good command of the language. They can write these stories and you can disseminate these stories much easier than in the past. There's internet, there's social media, and etc. And I think we must take advantage of it. And Azerbaijanis, there's so few people that write. There's so few people that write in English. So I think there's a little bit of that in me as well. Of okay, I need to tell the story because there's not a lot of people that can tell that story in English.
But it wasn't a calculated decision for you, right, to write in English. It was just simply that at the time you were still living in the US and you just went with what felt easiest, right? I mean, you lived for 20 years in the US. I bet you felt much more comfortable already, like writing and expressing yourself in English, which is considered to be your fourth language, right? If I am not mistaken, but it became eventually first, I bet.
I remember when I just moved to the US and people would ask me how many languages I know, and I would say 5, which is I speak Russian, I speak Azeri, I went to Azeri school, then I speak English, and then I speak Turkish and French, very basic French. But they would look at you as if you're a prodigy, and I used to be so surprised. And then I realized that if you look through that period that we had to go through, which is the 90s, so none of us woke up and said, okay, we're going to be these amazing prodigy children that speak 5 languages. Yeah. We spoke Azeri because a lot of us went to Azeri school because in the 90s, that national mood was back, right? Soviet Union just crumbled. There was one specific generation in 92, kids that went to school in 92 and 93 that became kind of a victim of that. Not a victim, but they got impacted by the upheaval of the national sentiment. And so what happened is a bunch of dads and moms said, I'm not going to let my kid go to Russian school because in the 90s, in 1990, the Russian army came in, they massacred hundreds of people. And so, emotions were kind of on the rise. So I actually went to school 1 year later because I didn't speak the language. And my dad said, no way, you're going to stay, learn Azeri and go to Azeri school. And I'm the only one in the family that goes to Azeri school. Meanwhile, my mom doesn't speak the language. My dad kind of doesn't speak the language because they both went to Moscow State University. My grandma is the only person that speaks Azeri. So to communicate with my mom and dad, I have to speak Russian. To communicate at school and with my grandma, I switched to Azeri. And then Turkish, because we're a new country and we just got disconnected from Soviet Union, the only other influence that we had at the time in terms of TV was Turkish TV. We would watch Turkish cartoons, not understand the word, but you're a kid, and if you want to watch something, you'll figure it out. So we get exposed to Turkish influence that way. So by the time I arrived to the US, the only language that I chose to study was French. I was in 11th grade. We used to watch this very popular sitcom, Hélène and her friends. And I was like, all right, I want to be like them. So my dad gets me a tutor. That's the only language that I learned. I made a conscious choice. So I came to the US and I speak 5 languages. And I'm trying to explain to people that, yeah, it's great, but it's like how history shaped us. It wasn't a conscious choice. To go back to your question, as far as English, it actually was a very calculated move. I experimented writing in Russian. And I, at some point, told myself that if I write in English, I'll reach a wider audience. And after that, it was a very calculated decision to read about 50 books in English and to practice writing in English and come up with what you would call a writing style. So I write in Russian now. I can write in Russian, but I don't have a style in Russian. My voice is developed in English, And it was very conscious because I knew that I can reach more people that way.
Interesting. Actually, am I allowed to read some quotes from your book? Because
Absolutely.
I actually highlighted a few quotes that either spoke to me in like my experience, or I was like, oh, this is going to be good like in the interview. But I have a lot of them, so maybe not all of them. But this one, since we're talking about languages, so I won't read the full paragraph, but just the last, I think, 3 sentences. So it's how the main character Mariam explains to I think, was it Russian? No, the teacher who was obsessed with Soviet Union. You needed 4 languages to get through the day. Nobody just decided to become a polyglot and pick up 4 languages by age 12. The number of languages was in a way proof of the twists and turns of history of our region, as our country was handed over from one empire to another, ending up as an independent state almost by accident. And I just feel like this explains everything you need to know about why Azerbaijanis can speak Azeri, Russian, Turkish, and English. Like, I think this is 4 most common, but you also know French. And this is like not because they're geniuses, but because it's just simply our history. Like this is what we had to do basically to continue living under empires or developing as independent state, like you said, with Turkish series or cartoons.
Yeah, I actually remember the character in the book is based on a professor that I had when I moved to the US. And it just so happened that he spent a lot of his not college, but grad school years studying Soviet Union in the context of Cold War, because Cold War in the US took a long time, and there is actually a big group of academicians that are really invested in that topic because it was very relevant at the time. Nobody knew how it's going to turn out. And there's a lot of interest around the psychology of a Soviet man. There's a lot of interest around how Soviet Union connected these very different cultures under one roof. And this professor, he was teaching American government at the community college where I went. And I would spend some time with him after class. Very quickly, I realized that he's incredibly fascinated. It's like as if you've studied something for years and then you found an artifact and the artifact is talking to you. So he had this fascination with Soviet Union. He had a very theoretic view of it. And I was an 18-year-old who grew up in the period when Soviet Union crumbled. I knew that story from a very matter-of-fact, day-by-day type of thing. As a child that grew up and saw it and just registered some of these things. So our conversations were very different because he would come up with some kind of a theoretical argument and I would be like, no, that's not what happened. Like, we don't grow up wanting to learn all these languages. It's just that we grew up in a period of chaos and the country was being influenced by different cultures. And as a child growing up, you get exposed to all these different cultures, popular culture, language, TV, etc., music. And that was a very interesting exchange. And I wanted to kind of capture that in the book, that she realizes that day-to-day stuff that she never even thought about is so fascinating to somebody who spent years studying it. And I think it also shows that when you study something, when you research something, there's a concept of an armchair economist, for example, somebody who's always sitting at home and trying to understand the market. It's a very true saying that, you can spend a lot of time studying something, but you end up learning much more when you're in the middle of it. And that was the contrast between this learned man and this 18-year-old girl that just saw some of these things firsthand.
But actually, was it the only time when you had experience like that? Because I feel like a lot of people have a lot of misunderstanding with Soviet Union. A lot of times they just call everything Russia while it's like 15 republics. And also, did you ever feel like mansplained topics that you personally went through, like with the Soviet life, or post-Soviet life, and then, no, you're wrong, this is not how it was, but you're like, but I lived there, you never been there. So like, if you had any experiences like that, less maybe positive, but still realistic.
Okay, I did have some experiences that were not exactly negative, but they were a bit ridiculous. I had this exchange once at a grad school where I was talking to my professor, and I think he was on the other side. Like, he thought of Russia as a place where mafia bosses are handling everything. And so I had some funny stories where he saw this danger and threat that mafia guys are going to come after me and stuff, and it was nowhere close to that. And then there's also the thing where people will think of you as somebody who has insider knowledge. Maybe you've had that. They'll be like, what's going on? What's Putin thinking? And I'm like, gosh, like, I don't know. I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah.
like you. I just read a couple of other things in Russian, but I don't know what he's thinking. I'm nowhere closer to this than you are. I had those funny stories. And America is definitely a place of a lot of stereotypes. So, yes, they kind of look at it as a one big, just blob on the map.
Yeah.
Everything is Russia. Everywhere is cold. I had some negative experience, which I think is captured in the book, where the Assyrians that were from Iraq, they didn't know what type of country it is. And I got some ridiculous questions like, how do they deliver mail? Do they deliver it with camels? And I was like, I don't even know if he's joking or if he's serious, because I had people that thought of Azerbaijan as a province in India. So I had that. And
Right,
then
I
I
read
had
that.
one
Yeah.
really funny experience. I just started working at Exxon, and I told this lady who was an admin, she was in the same room with me. I said, I'm from Azerbaijan. And then she said, my grandma was from Leipzig. And I swear for like 3 seconds, I was like trying to put, and I'm like, okay, there's like no comment. Leipzig? Seriously? And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, close by, you're close enough. So I had those ridiculous stories. US in that sense is an amazing place. You never know what people are going to think. But I've always lived, I guess, I have fewer of those stories as others because I've lived in these big cities that were very international. But I think Leipzig story would be my favorite.
Actually, it just reminded me a bit like off the topic, but I think it's still related to this. When I just moved to Prague, so I went to Anglo-American University, which is like in English, and American professors work there. And so we had a lot of exchange students from the US as well. And that was my first time meeting actually like Americans. So basically, growing up in Kazakhstan, I was always proud that I'm Caucasian from the Caucasus, right? And in Kazakhstan, if you meet anyone from the Caucasus, it feels like family. So it's not even like only Azerbaijanis, it's like Georgians, Chechen, Ingush. We have, all different mixes because Stalin was sending a lot of different ethnic groups there. So it's just normal. You grew up with Koreans, Uyghur, Tatar. It's just normal there. So I just always felt like Caucasians, we are the people. And so when I came to university, my first class was Intro to Mass Communications, I think. And it was actually taught by monk. So she's a monk, like she has the shaved head from, I'm not sure, but maybe Taiwan. Taiwan. Yeah, actually. And so it was just like cultural shock. I'm in Europe, first time. I never traveled abroad before. Like, this is my first time I'm studying here. Here's the monk teaching Intro to Mass Communication. And I'm sitting next to an American girl. And then the first class, and I get introduced to the whole race thing. Because in Kazakhstan, we have ethnicities and that's it. Like, what is your ethnicity? But then race never was a thing. And so she asked us to ask each other questions about our race, where we're from, etc. And so this American girl tells me, I'm Caucasian. And I'm like, no way, you are Caucasian? And she's like, yeah, like how Americans are? They're like, my great grandfather is like from Ireland. I was like, Ireland is Caucasus? But I was literally like sitting there. I was like, wow, Ireland is also Caucasus. Like, how did that happen? And then, it just took me some time to realize that Americans just have misunderstanding because it's actually Caucasian is a term for people from the Caucasus. It's just not used right by Americans.
There's a story. There's some story about it. I think it's like the white man, the first white man, originates from Caucasus, which is really hard to believe in, but okay. Yeah. Like somehow, and we were so amazed. Imagine you're coming to the US, 2003, you don't know any of this, and we have to go through the census. And I'm like, my God, they have a whole line for us. So we picked Caucasian, and then for a couple of years, we're like, great. They are so inclusive, right? They included this. There's like 4 boxes, and one of them is Caucasian. And then I heard somebody say that again, like just like that, and I was like, "Really? You're Caucasian? Or you guys are really confused?"
Yeah,
Then it turned
yeah,
out I was confused, but somebody went wrong with that title. Although you need to read up on it. It is very confusing, and
yeah.
Caucasus is not like a huge place. It's like one little mountain range. Somehow that's where the white man originated from.
I love those TikToks now where like Gen Z love to talk about it. They're actually becoming aware of the fact that white people steal not only land but other people's names as well. I think it's due to the fact that Caucasians were under Soviet Union and like weren't able to speak English, go out there and say, "Hey, listen, you're misusing our term. We're Caucasians." And I feel like we're the first generation to be like, wait, you're not Caucasian, you're European. Caucasian is a person from the Caucasus. So I just think like I stand by this, that white people need to stop calling themselves Caucasian. If your roots are not from the mountains of the Caucasus, you're not Caucasian. Stop using it. It's our term. Because I think Caucasian nations, they're just very unique in their like rules. They're very similar to each other and yet so different. And so I do think that we deserve our own category. We're not quite Middle Eastern, we're not quite European, we're like in between.
So in between, so in between. And even if you step away from kind of categorizing yourself, it's you get it firsthand when you see others, when you see people from Turkey or from Iran or from Kazakhstan. You get it. You're like, I have so much in common, but yet there's so much that's totally not in common.
Yeah.
And then you feel it, and then when you realize that if you're looking at somebody who's kind of similar and it's all the same in your head, you're totally missing something because you're an outsider. You don't know the commonalities and things that are different. You just got to be really careful there.
And actually, that moves me to my next question, I guess, about the book. But it's just really interesting how Mariam, the character, yet again, if you didn't read the book, the main character is Mariam, how she, when she arrives to her first job, which is this optical store, right? She works for Assyrian people. She's fascinated that they still exist because she learned about them from history books, and here they are asking her like what type of what religion is she, right? And what type of Muslim she is. And she's like, I need to ask my mom about it. I'm not even sure myself. But then what really spoke to me as another immigrant is how she saw like Russian stores and Georgian stores, and how Georgian man was like, are you Georgian? And she's like, Azerbaijani. Like, I'm maybe paraphrasing, but that's how I remember it. And he's like, neighbors, and that's like the feeling of community that post-Soviets still have. Like, what was your experience with that, and why did you decide to include this in Mariam's story? Like, what does it tell the reader that we need to know about her and just experience that you had as an immigrant?
Well, I think when you're far away from a place where you grew up, and you are, before Mariam moves to US, before anybody moves away from their hometown, you don't ever consciously ask yourself about your identity in the community, in the kind of a community of the world. You think of yourself as Azeri. You don't compare yourself to Georgians. You're never around Georgians unless you go there for tourism purposes. You are exposed to other cultures, either through immigrants that have already assimilated, or you're traveling and it's 5 days and you kind of get it, forget about it. But when you're if you're like in a country like US where everybody came from somewhere and the sense of community is suddenly gone, you are looking for anything that's familiar. And all of a sudden, if before you never really identified with Russia, for example, you suddenly realize, well, I've spent the whole time listening to this Russian music, so I'm kind of like, I guess I have something in common with Russian. And that's why when Mariam ends up in a Russian music store, she's listening to all this music and she feels something, which is very unique feeling when you're away from home for the first time and you end up in a place where something is calling you, something is familiar. That first feeling it's such a pull. It's such a kind of hard to describe pull, which I tried to show, but it's really beyond words what you experience in your heart that moment. It's a pain and bittersweet feeling of, I know this, I've heard this, but at the same time, I'm not there anymore, and I'm aware of that. And once you leave, you always carry a bit of that sadness with you. And I think when Mariam goes to these stores, she goes to the music store, she realizes that the owner, the person who set up the store, has music that ends at a certain point. Like, it's all the stuff that she knew, but then in, like, let's say year 1996, it stops. And she can tell that it's almost like that's when that person moved and time stopped there, because when you move, you do solidify that period of when you moved and those emotions and feelings and everything. And she recognizes that sadness. The store owner, she's been there for a while, obviously. She sees Mariam and she can tell, like, oh, this is a newbie. She's going through the rough period now, even though she's an 18-year-old. And the same happens with the Georgian. She comes in and he has a very short exchange with her. But then he says, it gets better. It's just a quick phrase. Right. But they have that exchange. And through that, you realize that even with them, people from a country that you've never lived in, you have that in common. You have this homesickness in common, and you have bits and pieces of that culture together. And I think that's definitely the case for the entire CIS community, Azeris, Georgians, Kazakhs. We all miss something, a vibe that was there that's really hard to put into words, but it brings us together in a foreign country.
And also in the book, Mariam basically is a lot with other immigrants. But like for you, when was the moment when you started hanging out more with Americans, if ever? Because I know that in the US, somehow, like, yes, it's diverse, but a lot of different groups, they stick together. So Asians with Asians, Black people with Black people, for many reasons. But what was your experience?
My experience was, I remember that when I moved from Chicago to Washington, which was in 2006, I was in an international program there, and it was a group of American students, and it was a group of European students. I remember being really surprised that I clicked with the Europeans right away, and we had so much more in common than me trying to click with Americans. At that point, I was there for 3 years. I had more in common with the Europeans, and I clicked faster with them than with the Americans. So it was a long process for me. Nevertheless, I was more immersed into kind of this program, and I think I got closer to some of the Americans. Yet I felt that big kind of a border between us. And I would say what really helped me, the moment when I moved away from that, is probably when I started working at ExxonMobil, which I started working there in 2013. At that point, I was in the country for a long time, right? 10 years. And you get to work on things together, and that boundary is suddenly it's going away, and you realize people are people everywhere. So that's when I started having American friends. But for the longest time in the US, it's such a country of immigrants that you have these communities that stay within that culture and stay within that comfort zone for decades, never come out, and are happy with that. So that sense of freedom to do whatever you want, to talk to whoever you want, and not feel like you need to assimilate, it's very unique to the US. Anywhere else you go, you're going to have a majority, and you're a newcomer. Here, it's a melting pot. Everybody came from somewhere. Everybody's hanging out with their own group, and nobody feels like they need to assimilate. You assimilate in some ways in terms of language and work and things like that. But in terms of your personal life, also US has this very strong understanding of personal space. It's very respected. And so you get to do you in the US, and nobody questions that.
Also, you moved after 2001, 9/11, and you being Muslim, like as an Azerbaijani, we are not practicing, we're non-observant Muslims, but we're still like, it's our cultural, I always explain to people, it's more like of a cultural thing than religious. It's like, there are Jewish people who are not religiously Jewish, but they're Jewish. And I feel like for post-Soviet people, that's the same. Because, again, Soviet Union wouldn't allow our parents, grandparents to believe in God or go to church, mosque, anything. And so here we are calling ourselves Muslim, but then, people don't fast, for example, or drink alcohol. Like, it depends. But did you ever experience Islamophobia after 9/11, due to your move after 9/11, I mean?
I thought it was really interesting how the only exchange that I had that really startled me was with the Assyrians, when they asked me if I was Muslim. And at that point, the Assyrians are Christians. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I answered the question, and it was the first time when I felt like the answer really will determine something, that it means something to them, whether I say Muslim or not. So before I answered, I was like, this is an irrelevant detail, nobody cares. So I said Muslim, and I kind of saw that he got curious and asked me the second question of, are you Shia or Sunni? And I genuinely had no idea. So I told him in a very naive way, I said, I'm going to ask my mom, I'll let you know.
Yeah.
And he just laughed and said, you don't know? I said, yeah, I don't know. In fact, I asked my mom later. It turned out that she was Shia and my dad was Sunni. And this is the first time I ever heard. I had no idea. And then the thing that he answered, that this is what he said afterwards, I was really confused. He said, it's okay. We're all human beings. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm forgiven for being a Muslim. So that was one case where I felt like, does it even matter? But after that, I have never had a case in 20 years in the US where I felt like that the fact that I'm culturally Muslim, which you're absolutely right on, played a role. I lived in very international cities. I was in DC, then I was in Houston, which is, I think, number 3 in terms of being multicultural because of the oil industry. So I've been lucky in that sense. But my husband had a very negative experience when he just moved to the US. He was renting a room very close to campus, and very soon he realized that he's renting a room with missionaries that have dedicated their life to convert Muslims to Christianity. And they were not exactly very friendly about it. And so he had a very negative experience. And as it often happens, he went through that negative experience at the very beginning of his move to the US. At some point, he started fasting. At some point, he took religion more seriously because of this pushback. I never had that, but I do recall that I once had a very symbolic experience. I was fasting during Ramadan. It was sometime end of year. That's where Ramadan was happening that year. And I was living in a flat with 2 roommates, with an Israeli girl and with a German girl. And it just so happened that there were 3 fasts from like the Ramadan fast in Islam. Efrat was fasting. There was some day where I don't think theirs is a full fast, but there's certain things that you don't eat until a certain time. And a Christian fast was all happening on the same day. And we all had a tough day. We all went to work and then to study. And we broke the fast together, 3 of us. And to me, it was like, it's just, who cares, right? We're all different religions, but nothing prevents us to go to a Mexican restaurant and break our fast. So I always go back to that story, and I realized that, I remember what Hannah said. She was the German. She said, we're all here for some time, and we all should try to be nice to each other. Well, it did get worse and worse in the US. Sometimes you get shielded from day-to-day impact of that. But I remember when Trump got elected, I was shattered. I think a lot of people wouldn't believe that he got elected. And then that was not even the worst. And what he started doing with his Muslim ban and all that, crazy stuff that he would say on TV, it was devastating. It felt like living in a country that's just going down and down. So I think that at that point, even though I never had an experience where somebody directly accused me of anything, I felt like, this is not good. And it's going to get the country, it's going to radicalize the country very quickly. And it did. And it's still there. And I realized how much of that was really dormant and how much of it I didn't see because it doesn't happen in big cities. But I mean, you have like 4 or 5 big cities across the US. Everything else is rural America. And those places, people, they, it's not, America is not representative by these big metropolises. You got to look at the whole country. It's a huge country, 300 million people. And if you look at the majority, they were fully on board with everything that Trump was saying regarding immigrants from Mexico and the Muslim ban and all of that. So it was really stressful to be like, oh my gosh, this is where I live. This is where my kids are growing up. I mean, this is a nightmare. So that's when I really felt it, but more as a society. Yeah. Luckily, I haven't had those type of exchanges, but my husband, you ask him, he'll tell you. We talk about Soviet Union, and there was so much oppression that came with that period. But I think that overall secular environment that was present in all these countries that were more religious before Soviet Union, I think it allowed for some progress. It allowed for some some movement towards European culture. And so that ended up, that's why we are unique. It is still conservative. It's still very patriarchal, but the religion thing is not there. It's very light. And it was shocking to Azeris, to Americans, that there is this interesting blend of everything Middle Eastern, except, the part that they're kind of afraid of. So, my book is, it's the category that it's a bestseller in
Middle East. Yeah.
One, and the biggest one where I'm most proud of, because it's harder to become a bestseller in that category, is Middle Eastern literature on Amazon. The second one is Immigrants and Emigrants, which is also an up-and-coming genre. It's I think it's coming up because there's a second generation immigrants that are wanting to talk about this and tell these stories. So there are Korean writers, there are Vietnamese, there are Iranians, there are Russians. All of that second generation feels the need to tell that story. So the genre is now coming up because they're growing up and they know English much better than their parents, who came and worked immigrant jobs. And that's a second. And the third one is city life fiction, because so much of the book has this 2 characters of Chicago and Baku. And so it got, there's a genre, there's a category like that on Amazon, which says, you read a book, it's very focused on a certain city. I've had some emails from readers where they try to go and find if those the Georgian bakeries there. I met with an American student yesterday who with a very interesting story. So she was born in the US, in Texas. Then when she's 11, she moves to Baku, and her parents were teachers at an international school. She's here for like 8 years. So she's kind of a reverse immigrant. And now she's moving back to the US. So she's doing exactly the opposite of what I did. And we were talking to her, and she's going to Chicago. She's going to a college in Chicago. And she's like, I Googled the bakery and I found out that it was closed. And I'm like, yeah, it is closed. It's been closed after COVID. So I think it's really interesting how the city becomes a character in the book, and you end up getting attached. And it's the natural thing. That's what I do when I read. There's so many interesting stories like that. If you read Shantaram, if you're interested, I highly suggest. It's one of those huge books that are incredibly long, but it keeps you going. Because of that one book, there is a direct flight to Bombay from Istanbul, because there are hordes of people that are traveling there to look at those absolutely insignificant little areas that are described in the book, a circle, a kalaba circle, and a cafe where the main character goes, and bar, and there's a Shantaram tour. You come to Bombay, you sign up for a Shantaram tour. It's like a tourist thing now. So I think it's amazing, and it's a testament to how powerful some books can be, that you immerse yourself in the story so much you don't want to leave it. You want to take in as much as you can. There's I'll give you a book recommendation. In my opinion, the most beautiful book on love is written by a Turkish author. It's called The Museum of Innocence.
Is it Orhan Pamuk?
It's Orhan Pamuk.
Okay, it's been on my list for a while, so maybe it's a sign.
I tried to read Orhan Pamuk. He is an incredibly difficult writer to read. In fact, there's a club of people that didn't finish these novels. That's why they're there, because it's hard to get through it. It's his novels are very heavy, except this one. This one is about love. Every single page of this 500-page book is about love. And what he did is, after he finished writing it, while he was writing it, he developed a museum with things from this book. And you read a book, you go to that museum. I've never felt anything like it. You are immersed into this thing, and you're walking there with the book, and you're seeing cigarette butts and dresses and shoes, and it's crazy. It's really crazy how he was able to really make it into a physical experience. But this has happened for years, right? There's in London, there's a place where Sherlock Holmes was, supposedly there. And there's I said, there's a Shantaram tour, and the list goes on. So books have that magical impact on people, where when you really get immersed, you want to get the most of it. You want to get as much as you can.
Your book did that to me, that even though I never lived in Baku, I've never lived in the US, Chicago, anywhere. I moved from Almaty at the age of 19 to Prague. And I've been in Europe for 9 years, as an immigrant. I still consider myself an immigrant, and I'm proud of it. I'm definitely not one of those who wants to become European. I'm assimilate. No, I still have my roots, etc. But your book felt like reading my own experience, but yet different, but same, And I think really, I even posted it on my story. I think you saw it. So can I read this part? Because it's so it speaks to me. When they get the news, the family of Mariam get the news that her uncle passed away. And so, I'm just going to read it. Mourning miles away from those who passed left you one-on-one with the grief. It attacked you unexpectedly. It lived alongside you, rearing its ugly head to sting you without warning, and then lingered for days. Mourning away from your loved ones meant sorrow that never expired. You just learned how to live with it. It seemed as if by immigrating, we silently accepted the loss of all of our relatives. We didn't lose them to death, but to the distance that severed the connection. Death only furthered the damage. You'd miss a person and then suddenly realize they were no longer there to miss. This is so powerful to me. I think this is my favorite quote from the book, just because I went through that mourning process of losing my uncle as well. But I guess I can say I'm happy that Mariam was there with her mom and brother, because I was alone. And I just remember I was writing my thesis, I was graduating, and getting that news alone, the pain is unbearable, being away from the family and not being able to go and be with all of the people who are grieving, to be able to cry and feel comfort in grieving with others. And I've never heard anyone before talk about this specifically. It's being an immigrant, it's so many different things, but the fact that when you decide to move away, you need to understand you literally can say goodbye to everyone, because probably you won't be there when they'll die. I know this sounds so dark, but this is the reality.
You know what it made me think about? And this happened after I wrote the book, and I was rereading it, and enough time passed that I felt kind of moved by this passage myself. I don't think we ever questioned the purpose of, hundreds of things that we do when somebody dies. We just go on autopilot. And, you probably had that when somebody died. It doesn't have to be a close relative, but what you remember is the news come and the family gets together. It starts immediately. It's a 24/7 thing. You cover all the mirrors in the house. You constantly are cooking and serving tea and discussing. And for 40 days, the death of this person completely consumes normal life. Everything becomes on hold. And we think of it as traditions. Nobody ever questions why this is done. Why was it? What's the spiritual purpose of it? I don't think anybody does it with that purpose in mind. But what happens is for 40 days, in a group of close people, you truly mourn. Every minute of that day, what you think about is that person. And that is what's missing. And the funny thing is, what's missing is because you don't do it in 40 days, you spread that into years, because you get up and you go about your business, and then it hits you and it's so hard, and then you get yourself back to normal because nobody around you is going to pause life for you to go through this morning, so you keep going. Hits you again, so you take that amount of grief and you split it into tiny pieces, and it's just so much more difficult to do that because it feels fresh every single time. And I realized the wisdom of these rituals after I've gone through it. And it's just so wise. And I never thought of the purpose of this ritual. But yeah, it's you think about the person. That's the worst. When you remember that person, you remember something from his life or her life, and then you're like, oh shit, like it hit, and then you have to literally take a breath to get your balance back on. So I wanted to show that. That was one of the things on my list of how do I show that in a book. And you are the second person who highlighted that paragraph. I never thought anybody would, because you kind of have to go through it to pick up on that. I don't think you can understand that just by reading. And I'm so glad that I didn't cut it out, because it's one of the things that you sign up for when you move to another country. You sort of lose everybody, and like I wrote there, death just kind of makes it final. But you know, you end up being away from on the good moments and the bad moments and everything in between.
During the first interview for the website, if you're watching this, probably it will be up. You can go read more about Amazing Mary. But you mentioned getting approvals from people who you mentioned in the book. Can you like share this experience? Because I actually never knew about this, and now I'm like considering if I would ever write a book, having to go to those people and ask them for their permission. Like, how was it?
The rule is, if anybody in the book is recognizable, and if they're pictured in any way that can damage their reputation, which is a very vague definition, right? People feel very personal about what can damage their reputation. You could say something not nice and they'll say, my wife's going to read it and then I'm going to be in trouble, whatever. The definition is vague on purpose because fiction is, it's a vague topic. The rule is you have to reach out to them and you have to get their verbal or written consent that they don't mind this content from being published. Otherwise, you can get sued. And me being a debut writer, I think while I was writing it, and probably for a couple of years after, I had no idea this thing's going to get published. I was like, oh, I don't need to worry about this because this is never going to be an issue. Then I get the contract and I'm like, oh, I have a lot of personal information in this book. What do I do? So I went through the whole process of changing names, and that was actually painful because you get attached to the names and then you have to change. You don't want people to get recognized. But what I found out in the process is people take this very seriously. You know, if you have used them as a side character, they will read everything you wrote under a microscope. And most of the time they'll be pissed. They'll think that you didn't do a good job. Because you're as a writer, you're using them as a prompt. This could be like a side character and you need them to say whatever at a certain time. And they're saying it and they're like, this is my chance to stay in history, and she messed it up. Anyway, so lots of funny stories there. But what I've learned is people take this really seriously. And the few people that I reached out to, I thought that, I'll send them an email and say, hey, I wrote a book, it's fictionalized, but there's a character that's based on you. I thought I was going to get a response in 20 minutes and they'll say, good luck. I hope I hope your book becomes a bestseller and that'll be it. Instead, I got emails that were like, oh, I'm going to have my lawyers look at it and I'll get back to you. And this dragged on for weeks. And people really took this seriously. So I made a mental note to be aware of that in advance and either, talk to them in advance or maybe fictionalize them further. But yeah, you are supposed to send out consent forms. This is completely handled by your publisher. You have to get a response back in written, then you have to PDF it and send it so that it's on file. It's very touchy-feely, and I was lucky to get all my consent forms, but there were some people that were included in the novel as characters. I based some of the characters based on that I don't talk to, and I couldn't get in touch with them. And so I'm really hoping I'm not going to get an unpleasant surprise in the future. But, this is what writers do. They sometimes piss people off with what they write. I guess I signed up for it, so it's fine.
But okay, I don't want to spoil anything, but there's one character, the Assyrian character, that turns out to be the villain. Did you have to reach out to those people? Is it based on a true story? You don't have to go there, but I wonder how that person reacted to.
Completely fictionalized.
Okay, so none of this, and the person doesn't exist.
Let me just say it this way. Up until chapter 37 and 8.
It happened, yeah.
Lots of things were based on my story. And then everything after that is fictionalized. And so those characters were fictionalized in the sense that a lot of those things did not take place. Okay. And I didn't have to get a consent for that.
Well, that's really interesting. This law part of writing, I never even thought about it, but that's so fun.
There's a lot of technical stuff about writing and publishing that I learned. That's precisely why I took a year off, to understand the business side of it. And I'm glad I had the right attitude about it. I didn't, I trusted completely to the publishing house and the experts there in terms of titling and in terms of cover design and promotion campaign, ads and things like that. It all paid off. But yeah, it's an interesting thing that has nothing to do with inspiration. It's a creative process, but there's an existing industry with its own rules when it comes to how people buy books. There's a lot of it has to do with seasonality, when's the best time to release a book, and etc. And I'm glad I wasn't working, because I really learned all of that. And the second book will be much easier for me to combine with a daytime job.
My last question, although I do want to ask you so much more, but it's gonna be too long, and I hope one day I'll meet you in person in Baku, maybe in your studio, and we'll get to chat about it. Yes, I want to go back. I haven't been in Azerbaijan for 10 years, by the way. So, okay, my last question is, have you read the book Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert?
I haven't read that book.
Okay, but you have to, because I think it's really great for creatives. But I was just gonna quote her that it really helped me with whatever I do creatively, that once you create something, you need to let it go. It no longer belongs to you. Whatever criticism or feedback it gets, it's its own child, and you must let it go. So what about your book? What is the feedback? You went on a book tour. Have you been receiving any criticism? If yes, how are you dealing with it as a young author just who started, and you're still learning, like you said? So just share that part, because I'm sure writing a novel, it's its own journey, but then once it's out there, you can no longer control anything. So how is it for you?
Hard. When I decided to go on a book tour, which was completely my idea, I think I ended up facing 3 of my biggest fears. I went to the US. At that point, we were living here. My husband couldn't come with me, so it was just me. All of the events were organized by me, so there was a lot of logistical stuff that I had to do. I was organizing this book tour based on when people can host me. And so a lot of these events were happening back to back and it was driven by when the venues were available. I did not have to pay for any of these venues, and that's why I kind of had to be there when they will host me. I'm afraid of flying. I'm really afraid of flying, but I had to kind of fly on my own to the US. Second thing was public speaking. I'm okay with one-on-one interviews, but standing in front of a group of people and talking about a book, even if I wrote it and I know the answer to any question, was nerve-wracking for me. And the third thing was really doing this self-promotion thing. Felt very uncomfortable. I have done public speaking before. You get used to that, but I've never had something where I was promoting my own work. And I think from our cultural background, there's this taboo of, you don't praise yourself, you don't, promote yourself, you just don't do that. And then the reviews started coming in, and there is no magic around it. The first negative review you're gonna get. You will first of all, you will agree with everything it says, right? The inner critic will wake up and you'll say, yeah, exactly. That's why I told you to write this book. And I go through those emotional roller coasters. I don't have I don't want to say, oh, I'm used to it. No, it hurts every time. What I've noticed, though, is I had certain idea of how this book is going to touch people's lives. And I'm really happy to know that it did, but it did in ways that I did not expect. What I found out is the parts that I thought of as very basic, in a sense that this is the stuff that happens to everybody, the comparing of food and having those experiences that are very common, people ended up feeling very strongly about that, as opposed to the parts that I considered exciting and original and things like that. So I realized that people get drawn to exciting things that are outside of the normal, and to things that are very normal, very common. What I also found out is that some Americans will truly understand the experience or get a glimpse of it, and some will say, I don't know what she was talking about. So those reviews were a little hard to take, but I would say that overall I've been very lucky, in a sense that my book tour, as crazy of an idea as it was, debut authors don't go on book tours. Mm-hmm. They just don't, and they don't do it when the book comes out. It usually happens like 6 months later.
Right.
I did, and I gathered, bunch of people. I had 6 events. I had 9 events in 6 cities in a 20-day period. I sold hundreds of books online and offline, in these events. It was an exhilarating experience, and it was all thanks to a very community, both business and cultural, that reached out and supported me and provided these venues, and people that showed up. I had people that drove for 2 hours to come to my Brooklyn event. I was shocked that so many people came to support me. So I think because that experience was so overwhelmingly positive, it was enough for me to say, okay, you'll get some rotten reviews. That's normal. And then I always go back to, was this an honest story? It might be boring, it might be slow to some people, and some people finished it in one sitting, but was it honest? That's my ultimate test. And it was. It's a very sincere story. That's why it maybe lacks some of that, fast pace and the page turner and the conspiracy. And that's why I chose that story to be that way, because I knew that that's the story that's inside of me, whether people like it or not. Like you said, you let it go. It's hardest thing to let it go, but I think I'm getting there. I think I'm getting to leaving it alone. It reflects my writing ability at the time. It reflects the story that I wanted to tell, the judgment calls that I made as a writer, as an author. And I think I'm happy with it.
Thank you so much, Mary. Like, I loved your book, and like you said, you cannot like create something that everyone will love. But as an immigrant, Azerbaijani, as a woman, I felt a lot of connection to the main character. Although like I said, geographically, she's somewhere else and I am somewhere else, and different circumstances and everything. But I still think that immigrant experience is so similar for all of us, like the same struggle of trying to fit in and trying to not miss your home and trying to build a new home. So it just, I love the book, and I'm so grateful to be able to interview you and to get to know you personally. Is there anything else you would like to mention before we say goodbye?
Oh, well, I really enjoyed this conversation. I have had a lot of interviews, mainly dedicated to the book. And as an author, you always wonder if you were able to fully open up. And I definitely did. So that's completely to your credit. I'm really grateful. I loved the podcast format. Hopefully, I'll have more of these. I want to wish you all the best. And I want to end with an invitation to come visit Baku. I will personally introduce you to the city that I have been walking around. I've been wandering around for a year trying to reconnect. So I think I'll be happy to help you get reintroduced to Baku.
You know, I will definitely reach out to you now that you promised, and it's publicly. I will not let you go. I'm so happy to meet so many young, modern, contemporary, whether it's like writers or artists in Azerbaijan. It makes me so proud that like our community is growing, expanding, and achieving things. Like every time one Azerbaijani achieves something, I feel like it's my family member that achieves something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we're a small country, but we really, support each other. And I think that sentiment is at its absolute maximum the past 30, as long as the country has been around. So I think if you come here, you'll notice it. There's a different kind of air.
Right.
There's something else in the air, some really positive, transformative power. And the youth here, your generation, like even the younger generation, they're very hardworking. I find it that, we're in the right path. So waiting for you, just get on a plane, make it
Thank
here.
you. Thank you so much. Çok sağ ol.
So